I thought I would start with a pop quiz because I'm a sociologist and I like to take surveys and to wake people up a little bit. So we are in this beautiful setting, and I was curious by a show of hands, if you reflect on your everyday life, do you feel secure and safe? Who feels secure and safe in your everyday life? I would say that's probably almost 100% of the audience. Okay, interesting. And who here has visited Ukraine prior to 2022? Okay, maybe 40%, which is more than I expected. So I think if you have visited Ukraine, you will know that it looks a lot like any European country. Just some pictures to remind us of the place we're talking about. This is all before the full-scale invasion. This is Kyiv. Kyiv again. And Kharkiv. I wanted to show these pictures of Ukraine rather than the ones that we tend to see now of war-torn Ukraine. I think to remind ourselves of the fragility and vulnerability of this everyday feeling and sense of safety and security that we are lucky to have here in Sweden and elsewhere across the Western world. But this safety and this security is not only fragile, not only vulnerable. I will make the argument here that it is very much now an illusion. And I think the main point that I just want to convey throughout my talk is that despite the support that we have seen for Ukraine from Western countries, including a lot of allies outside of Europe and the United States, the West, broadly defined, is still asleep to the new reality of fragility and vulnerability. And why do I say that? Despite support for Ukraine that we have seen, billions and billions of military security and economic assistance. And I think the bigger question is, what would an alliance that is awake, not woke, but awake, look like and act like? So 3 main points throughout this presentation. 1, what is Russia's war really about? Well, we have to go back to 2013 and 2014 because this war is now not over 2 years old, it's actually over 10 years old. And what is it really about for Ukraine? Well, for Ukraine, it's obviously about self-determination and desire to be part of the Western and European world. These are pictures from 2013, 2014, what was then called the Euromaidan, now it's called in Ukraine the Revolution of Dignity. And at the time, I was visiting Ukraine quite a bit. I was living in Europe. There was a direct flight back then from Zurich to Kyiv, not anymore. And I was really taken with the fact that we didn't quite acknowledge, especially in European capitals, that Ukrainians were holding EU flags. And I would venture to say this was probably the first time of citizens being killed in the service of European values and principles and in their desire to join not just Western civilization, democracy, but the European Union. And I think this was a lost opportunity for Europe. And it was a lost opportunity for the West to have an ally in Ukraine, to have a country that could, at that time, have become much more easily integrated into the European Union and eventually NATO. So for Ukraine, this is about the West. What is this about for Russia? Well, it's also about the West, because there are many examples that I was looking at and trying to figure out what is the best Putin quote to share with you. There are so many gems to choose from. But clearly over the last several years, and even before February 24th, 2022, the main narrative that Russian officials, especially President Putin, were putting out about Ukraine was that this was Russia's war against the West. This is not about Ukraine. It is not about territory. It is about the Cold War-style civilizational great power battle of Huntington-esque war clash of civilizations between what the Russian vision of itself is as a great power, a great empire, that is by definition against Western values, principles of open societies. So for Russia, And you will hear Putin say this over and over, and it sounds kind of confusing, that he will say, we're not fighting the Ukrainian people. We are fighting the West. So some great quotes. I think going back to 2007, the now very famous speech that Putin gave at the Munich Security Conference, where he says, and this is just one of the quotes from a very long speech, that a world in which there is one master, one sovereign, talking about the United States, obviously, it is a world that is at the end of the day a pernicious world. And this is where Putin lays out his vision that he then acts upon quite immediately in Georgia in 2008, and even earlier in 2007 with various Russian-sponsored cyber attacks on Estonia, to try to start to put an end to what he sees as a world dominated by one system and led by one country. And then 1 year after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Putin gives a much anticipated and long overdue, I suppose, public address where he says, we aren't fighting the Ukrainian people. Ukraine has become a hostage of the Kyiv regime, whatever that is, and its Western masters, which have effectively occupied the country. It's they, meaning the West, who have started the war, and we are using force to end it. So for Ukraine, this is about self-determination in the West, and for Russia, this is about defeating the West and ending US global leadership. And what is the outcome that has led to? Well, certainly Russia is now on a war footing. The official Russian defense budget is the largest one we've seen since the end of the Cold War, which is about 6% of Russian GDP now is going to defense expenditures, and about a third of total budget expenditure as a whole going to defense, outranking Russia's spending on social welfare programs and other domestic priorities. And this is the official budget. Most experts think, including myself, that the so-called unofficial budget that we don't see is probably closer to 40 to 50%. So when you think about a country like Russia, whose economy is actually projected to grow despite Western economic sanctions, spending likely close to 50% of its entire state expenditures on defense, and then we compare that to the fact that right now, despite the fact that we're all very happy to have Sweden and Finland as the newest members of the NATO alliance, only 18 out of 32 NATO member states meet 2%. So that one statistic in my mind, Russian expenditures on defense, Western countries' expenditures on defense, I think encapsulates why the West is asleep to the reality of the threat that we are facing in Moscow. So the bottom line is that this is a war about the future of the West and the durability and legitimacy of Western civilization at large. But a few examples of why I don't see a transatlantic alliance that is awake at the wheel, that is setting the agenda, and that this basic principle, this is not about Ukraine but about the West, hasn't fully been absorbed in policymaking and decision-making circles. So there are a lot of examples I could choose from, but two just very recent ones. We, of course, just had the G7 summit. And one of the big outcomes of the G7 summit was a deal on what to do about the frozen Russian assets, about $320 billion, mostly in Europe and a handful of European countries that were frozen after Russia's invasion. And there's been, of course, a huge debate as to what to do with these assets. And the deal that has been reached and was very much applauded across Western media in particular, is to leave the actual assets untouched, but then use the profits, the interest from those assets to secure a loan for Ukraine. The mechanics of that are still very unclear. Who's going to give the loan? What percentage of the loan? Who's really going to make this happen? But this is the basic deal, to get Ukraine a $50 billion loan using collateral from the frozen asset interest. However, that means the $320 billion will remain untouched. And if we think about the amount of money that we're going to need to make sure that Ukraine not just survives, but actually is able to rebuild, and the kind of commitments that have been made so far, without that 300 or so billion, there's almost nothing committed or certainly transferred to allow Ukraine to rebuild itself. I mean, there's some initiatives, but they pale in comparison to what the actual needs are, which are approximately $500 billion. So I don't see this as a positive, frankly. Second quick example, in the military domain. Again, very recently, the United States not only sent long-range missile systems to Ukraine, the ATACMS systems that have a 300-kilometer range, they have finally, the US administration finally allowed Ukraine to use those capabilities to hit targets in Russia. But, there's always a but, there are still limits on what the Ukrainians can use US systems for. So the US administration a few weeks ago made the announcement Ukrainians can hit Russian logistical lines. Basically, they're being used to attack Kyiv. So some folks in the room here I know have a military strategic background. If you think about having to fight a war when you're not allowed to touch enemy troops, you're not allowed to attack military targets that are literally across your border until they enter your sovereign territory, it's a complete disaster. Nobody fights wars like this. The US doesn't fight wars like this. And so the fact that the Ukrainians weren't able to do that until just now, and now they're still limited in only being able to do that across the Kharkiv line, is a huge, huge problem that I don't think we're going to get much of a change to. So again, another policy change that was long overdue, celebrated, but is certainly not enough. And I think lastly, what will we look for? What I look for is my second point, but it's actually a 6-point plan. So it's sort of an illusion that it's a second point. What would an awake alliance actually look like? What will we be doing that's different than what we're currently doing? Well, I think point number one, clearly we will be providing Ukraine with everything it needs, rather than debating whether a system will lead to escalation, whether the Ukrainians can actually use that system. Give the Ukrainians what they need to fight and let them decide how they should deploy it on the battlefield. Of course, the Taurus systems the Germans haven't approved. The Gripen planes that Sweden is supposed to send but is now being delayed because of, I think, US concerns about interoperability of the F-16s, which aren't even in theater yet. All of these different questions that were really on the table in the first months of the Russian invasion have continued to be a painful incrementalist approach that we have seen over time, really hamper Ukraine's ability to fight Russian aggression. And I think the point here as to why I'm so very much advocating for stopping this incremental approach, especially one that is being driven by Washington right now, is there are a lot of conversations happening in Washington about how whatever we may provide Ukraine might affect our preparedness in the future to fight an imaginary but potentially likely war over Taiwan with China, or our ability to supply other allies like Israel, for example, in its fight against Hamas. So we're basically holding all of our stocks down because we have dozens and dozens of so-called preparedness plans that could be affected if we provide a certain system, like ATACMS is a big one, to Ukraine. But I think my point here is that we're really suffering from a profound lack of not just leadership, but imagination. Because in our minds, we're fighting the war of the future, while there is a war happening today. So number 2 of the 6-point plan, double down defense spending. I think that's obvious. Number 3, sanction Russian banks, which we haven't done. We have deployed sanctions. They overall have had some effect, but not enough in effect. Russia's economy is still growing. Number 4, and I think this is a critical one, we have to stop playing out our own red lines, which you have done from the beginning of the conflict, basically allowing Putin to set the agenda and to deter very effectively. Nuclear deterrence works incredibly well. The Russians have shown us how well it works because they have deterred us. Number 5, go after Russian assets, not just the frozen assets I discussed, but Russian intelligence and security assets. The sabotage operations that we've seen over the last 2 years in Europe should be a shock to every single European country. Assassination attempts, poisoning, sabotage of critical infrastructure and cyber infrastructure. It's quite shocking, and we're not acknowledging that as the kind of attack on the West that the Russians are carrying out. And lastly, and I'm happy to talk about this later, we need to commit to a long-term strategy of 21st century containment. Because at the end of the day, there are very unlikely to be any profound changes in Russia with or without Putin. Wrapping up here, there's risks involved. And much of our strategy and our approach to Ukraine has been buttressed against interpretation of risk and escalation. But to my mind, the biggest risk would be losing in Ukraine. Because the risk that you often hear policymakers discuss, if we were to double down to have a more assertive, less incremental approach, is a Russian defeat. This is a real risk that people think about, that a win in Ukraine will somehow lead to Russian disintegration. So my point to that is Russia's existed just fine without Ukraine. There's no reason to think that Russia needs Ukraine to survive. Another risk, nuclear escalation. Nuclear escalation is manageable, and we did it for decades during the Cold War. And in fact, and there's some nuclear specialists here, most would agree that the risk of nuclear escalation from Russia is actually quite low. It has gone lower and lower rather than higher and higher as we have provided more to Ukraine. The real escalatory risk would happen if the Russians win in Ukraine. That would be a disaster in terms of potential escalation. And then lastly, that our policies are somehow contributing to the Russia-China alliance. That is true. If we isolate Russia more from Western systems, they have no choice but to become more of a junior partner to Beijing, and we see that happening as we speak. But I would say we have little control over that. That was already happening. That was already a process that was underway, regardless of Western actions in Ukraine. So what does this have to do about the markets and the theme of this conference, okay? So my final point here is that, well, the outcome of the war is already having and will continue to have profound reverberation effects across global markets. We really underestimated how significant Ukraine and Russia too is part of global markets in energy, obviously, in grain. All of these other commodity markets have already been affected. The risk of escalation, if the Ukrainians don't win this war, will disrupt global markets. And lastly, I think Ukraine's resilience in the face of Russia's military aggression, economic resilience, is something that we need to learn from. I've often thought about a country like, I don't know, pick a country, Italy, Greece. I won't say Sweden because I think Sweden would probably survive and do quite well. But the fact that Ukraine's soldiers, Ukraine's teachers have been getting paid, that people can use banks, all of these infrastructure resilience that we have seen in Ukraine, I think is really profound, and we really don't give the Ukrainians much credit for their ability to not just survive, but continue to function as an economy, even as they're fighting a massive war against a much bigger and capable enemy. So thank you for that.
If you were to pick one single Western decision that would really make a big change, big difference, what would that be?
NATO membership.
For Ukraine?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, thank you.